marketplace for places on stage, if anyone wants to bid. Well, welcome to the panel on the sharing economy. I'm Sam Schechner. I cover tech for the Wall Street Journal here in Europe. And joining me in this order is Paul Holland from Foundation Capital. He has been investing a lot in the on-demand economy lately. Then to his right is Evan Stites-Clayton, co-founder of Teespring, a marketplace where you can design and sell your own apparel. And then we have Jorge Pilo, co-CEO of EasyTaxi. Platform connects drivers with taxis in Latin America. And so, yeah, I don't know if you guys want to just start by introducing yourselves and a little bit of what each of your companies does and why you're here, and then we'll jump right into the discussion.
Sure. So EasyTaxi, as you mentioned, Sam, it's a platform to connect passengers and drivers, and we focus really in Latin America. We are in every country from Mexico down to Chile, and what we do is we use existing supply of transportation in the region, in the cities, to connect with the people. The thing that particularly is in Latin America, and when it comes to sharing economy, is that supply is already there. Hailing a cab in Bogota, in Lima, in Sao Paulo was fairly easy. There were enough taxis, but there was no platform to connect it. So there was no safety, there was no rating, there was no visibility. And EasyTaxi was the first company, or the only regional company that managed to do this at a scale. And now, globally, we're one of the biggest players in the space.
Hi, my name's Evan. I'm a co-founder of Teespring. So what our platform allows people to do is create and sell custom apparel or other types of merchandise and get up and running with their own businesses very quickly online. So, compared to the traditional sharing economy companies like something like EasyTaxi, Uber, Airbnb, people are bringing a resource and then they're leveraging something about their resource and their time to share with other people and to make money. And that's kind of a similar dynamic that plays on Teespring, except that people don't actually have to have anything really starting out, just an internet connection and a computer where they can design and then they can start selling and creating their own merchandise. But in the same sense of these other sharing economy companies, we have many of our users who are actually making their living full-time selling products through our platform.
My name is Paul Holland. I'm a general partner at Foundation Capital. We have about $3 billion under management across 8 different funds. We're about a 20-year-old firm. A while back, we funded a little company called Netflix, which later became a much bigger company, taught us a lot about what consumers were looking for in terms of paying by the drink versus having to buy the whole cow. More recently, we've done a number of sort of marketplace economy companies like Lending Club, Lending Home, Dog Vacay, Home Suite, Pier Space, and a bunch of others. So happy to talk about any of those things. Prior to coming to Foundation, I had a fairly long operating career. I helped a guy named Reed Hastings start his first company called Pure Software. And then obviously he went on to do much greater things as one of our investment CEOs at Netflix. And then I also worked with a guy named Mark Gainey at Kana, and now Mark has gone on to do Strava, if any of you guys are big athletes.
All right. Well, so when you think about the sharing economy, and you guys come from, look at it all from different points of view, on one hand you think about all of the potential opportunity that unlocks when you have individual people perhaps working directly with other individual people, and then also for the companies that can intermediate those transactions. But there's also been, and in Europe where we are, but also elsewhere in the world, a fair amount of hand-wringing and concern and sometimes regulatory pushback against companies in your space. And I don't think it's fair to say that that's only companies that have been disrupted trying to work the ref. Like there are legitimate issues at play here. So I'm curious, what's your take on the role of the sharing economy and the pushback for that? Paul, do you have a feeling?
So I think from my perspective, it's pretty simple. You either need to get with it or get out of the way. The sharing economy isn't going to go away. It's going to expand and become a larger and larger piece of society as a whole. I think what we're seeing right now is the normal disruption that occurs when there's a new thing that occurs across the board in the economy. I think that it's going to be fairly simple. You can divide the world now into the governments that will oppose this, and those places will be less wealthy, and the places that endorse it and embrace it, and those places will be more wealthy. And I just put a punctuation point on this just to indicate, if you look at where we are in Northern California, we have a negative unemployment rate. I mean, one of the reasons for that is that we have a ton of innovation that's happening. One of the things that I find really interesting about this is that, and as you know, we talked about the fact I'm kind of an amateur historian on the Silicon Valley. I did this movie called Something Ventured a few years ago about the origins of the Silicon Valley. Back then, it was a focus on, selling to other PhDs and masters in computer science and creating products that could work for them. Companies like an Apple, companies like an Intel, and others. Today, it's more about disruption, and it's disrupting current marketplaces. In the course of doing that disruption, I think one of the most exciting parts is, really for the first time, the Silicon Valley is funding organizations that will employ tens of thousands of relatively underskilled workers. And that's never been the mission of Silicon Valley companies, really, until the last, say, few years. Now, there's going to be disruption associated with that, but when I look at economies across Europe and some parts of the world where you see youth unemployment and young people unemployment are touching 25%, I mean, I'd love to see some of those people going to work in some of these on-demand economy companies and then building up their careers over time. But you got to have a place to start, and these places are employing tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people.
Either guys have a take on that?
Sure. So we operate in several countries, and as Paul mentioned, we see very different approaches to the situation. From very open governments, like in Chile, for example, are very willing to open laws or create new laws to allow for the sharing economies, and governments that are less likely or are less willing to actually open new opportunities to this disruption. And what we see is some companies just try to go straight at the government and fight with them head to head. We've taken a bit of a different approach. Even while the government might be against it, there's still a very big business there. So there's still opportunity in those areas. You just have to try to find a way on how do you make the sharing economy work without going against the government. So in our case, there's still a large supply of cars there. So how do you work with a legal supply and make it work? In the countries where there's no regulation, then you have more opportunities, but you also have less barriers to entry. So if you are agile enough, you still have a very viable business in these locations, which higher barriers to entry. So you can actually build a good fortress there.
I think that sharing economy for me is all about removing barriers. Like you said, it's taking the resources that already exist and getting more out of them. It's definitely something that we think about a ton at Teespring is how can we kind of just make everything easier so that this type of entrepreneurship can just happen, that the existing hurdles that people would have to go over are cleared. And that's where you get into these feelings of like inevitability. Like, of course, these barriers are going to come down. Of course, things are going to be progressing in that direction. I think the impacts of that are overall are positive. There's also, I wouldn't say that I wouldn't hold up Silicon Valley and say that it's like this amazing fantasy land. We have certainly plenty of issues there in terms of, you see the impact that all of this change is having, and it is, as much as it creates work, it also does create some sort of stark income disparities, and you can see these sort of gaps start to emerge between the tech workers who are getting shuttled around in these cars and then the people who are actually servicing them, or with something like Airbnb. It's awesome that my house is now probably worth 2 or 3 times as much, because if I want to Airbnb it out, I can make that much more money. But it's just that much harder for somebody who's sort of entering into trying to get a house to ever come and live in San Francisco. So that's kind of the flip side of it for me, but I still love it. I mean, it's definitely the direction things are moving in.
But so, okay, the direction things are moving in, but you raise an interesting question. Are we moving, is this a shift of wealth? Are we creating an app underclass, with the on-demand economy? I can summon employees summoned at the touch of a finger? I'm curious. Paul, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I think, I've kind of been dealing with these issues for a long time in high tech, and you can look for the negative in anything. I got news for you. I mean, I've been in the Silicon Valley for 31 years. The income disparity was huge well before any on-demand economy company started. These are much more fundamental societal issues that come down to things like education, prejudice, access, income, all these other different things that are happening. I take a more simplistic approach to looking at these companies, including the companies that are represented here on stage. They represent growth and jobs, right? They represent opportunities for people. A young person can come work for EasyTaxi and then work their way up over time and become, a more significant manager, buy a home, whatever it might happen to be. So I'm a sort of a perpetual techno-optimist, and it'll shine through in these kind of comments. I will make one other comment, though, that I think is also very positive about this. The notion of the sharing economy, I'm 54 years old, and my generation and the generation before me took great pains to, go out of the way to say how environmentally focused we were going to be. I have this very green house. I've done all these other things around it. I will say that this generation, in my mind, is going to do way more for the environment than mine did or the one before it did, in part because what they're doing in terms of sharing resources. You don't need a new car. You don't need a new house. You can essentially pay by the drink for a lot of these things. And as we start to see these things become more pervasive, you're going to start to see a number of things change around the consumer nature of the economy. Bill Ford was on stage yesterday saying, look, they recognize they're going to sell fewer cars to millennials because they're just figuring out ways to get things done by sharing these resources. And I just think there's a lot of positive here that can be explored. And one of the reasons I'm so forceful about counseling people to focus on that side is that I believe it's inevitable. And so we can spend all this time picking at the edges of it, but at the end of the day, this is the way the economy is going to move. And you should just try to figure out a way to adapt to it or get involved.
I think another point is the sharing economy by itself is very democratic. And while before, as a supplier, you had to sell your shirts or drive your car, you had to belong to a big organization. It was very expensive. So actually the access to more demand was very restricted. So actually the sharing economy is allowing more demand to be connected to the supplier. So you actually, while you might be creating a disparity with the owners of those very big firms, the overall bar is actually being raised. So these people now can sell their shirts very easily, they can drive their car, so their income is becoming higher. Yes, there are a couple of mega rich people in San Francisco, but the majority of people are actually considerably better off.
I mean, are there, in terms of employment, because that is a question that comes up, I mean, for a company like Uber, if all of its drivers, or for EasyTaxi, if all of your drivers became your employees and you had to pay benefits, the business wouldn't work, presumably, right?
Yeah, and that's one of the big challenges on how do you make this work with the current legal situation, right? We work in an environment based on almost contract workers. Our drivers are not exclusive. They can help people off the street. So we're just a portion of their demand. Once you become a exclusive source of their demand, there are a lot of issues popping up. Now, do you have a responsibility with that driver? Do you actually get to call how he should be dressed and when should he drive? We don't get into that portion. But once you're there, yes, there are a couple of issues you might wonder: is that fair? Is there sub-employment, which they call it now?
But I mean, Evan, for instance, if somebody is making their living selling apparel on your platform,
Right.
That's a great opportunity they wouldn't have had before, but in the U.S., I mean, still health insurance, I mean, a lot of the benefits, I mean, how livable is that really, do you think? Are there issues to be tackled there in terms of making a reasonable life?
Our users are all over the world, and we have people who are, for example, like in Vietnam selling shirts to people in the U.S., and that's, the amount of money they're making for their exchange rate is incredible. So like it's the equivalent of like $1 million salary in many cases. I do think that one issue that kind of comes up if you introduce more of these regulations or start to these employees need to be treated the same. It's like that would basically force the prices of the taxi rides up. And so now what you've ended up with is, yes, the drivers are getting paid more, but now the service is no longer available to maybe people who aren't making as much money. So it becomes a more exclusive service in spite of the fact that you've actually given the drivers a better benefit. So there's that push and pull with regulation and treating them as employees.
So, I mean, what do you think? I mean, there's obviously so much untapped potential. It seems like you all agree that this is basically going to happen anyway. So what, as responsible investors, entrepreneurs, do you do to make sure that it evolves in the way that you feel most comfortable with? I mean, maybe not just maximizing your return, although I know, Paul, that's your job, but...
Yeah, I think the thing is, I think a misnomer or a misinterpretation of this is that the people that are involved either as the management or on the boards of these companies are somehow like consciously insensitive to the concepts that you're talking about. We spend a ton of time in the board meetings talking about these type of things, right? Like how can we make sure that we're in compliance with the law, first and foremost? How can we make sure that, whether it's any of our companies in our portfolio, how can we make sure our employees are respected and that they're making their goals as best they can within the context of whatever the jobs are. So I think it's less about kind of looking for an opportunity for exploitation. It's more around just simply trying to create successful companies that match a need within the marketplace with a supply. And that's what these companies are doing, basically. I mean, we're stripping out the veneer of the large corporation to some extent, and we're basically putting people who need something in touch with people who are willing to supply it at a fair rate. And that exchange in the middle are these new companies from that perspective. And like I said, I think as a business model, it's just incredible. And there'll be dislocation along the way. There'll be challenges and struggles, but I think when we get to the other side of that, you're going to see some of the largest companies in history created in this time frame around these concepts.
But are there special things on top of just letting the business model run its course that you think need to be done, or is it maybe, or not? I'm curious.
So I think there's still the point of legislation which is key, right? And I think countries have taken different approaches to this thing. Ones go straight towards regulation and forcing employment laws, and others have taken a much open market approach, say, okay guys, you figure it out and sort it out. And we still don't know how it's going to work out. What's happening in North America, they see in California, in Silicon Valley, the business is blooming, but you're starting to see this friction in society about is this fair? And you have other countries where it's fair, but it's not growing. So we don't have an answer yet, and we try to actually work with individual governments and city business, in our cases with cities, to try to figure out what works best for them. Because in the end, we don't work in a vacuum, right? And if we end up with a system that is fair but not growing, or grows but is unfair, it's gonna kick us in the future. So we don't have an answer yet.
I think what we need to do as leaders of these companies, and possibly from a regulation standpoint as well, is just try to get as many people as possible involved in this process and bring them up along with kind of what's happening. For us, it's always been about empowering that individual entrepreneur to do things that they couldn't have done previously. Like you said, like before you would have had to have your own t-shirt factory to actually sell t-shirts. Now you can just kind of go online with no startup costs and start doing it. But there's even then, who is actually the person that's driving for EasyTaxi, or the person that's selling t-shirts on Teespring? Can we make it easier for people to get involved in that process? Can we make it something that everyone in this room can get involved in, that everyone out there can be a part of? The more people we can kind of bring into what we're doing, I think the more positive of an impact we'll have.
And I guess we're almost out of time, so I wonder quickly if each of the three of you have some idea in this sharing or on-demand economy of where there's still opportunities. There's a lot of different companies out there, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts of things that have yet to be shared sufficiently.
So I think banking is a place which is still interesting. Try to look for these industries where you see very large companies managing everything, right? And there's no peer-to-peer, right? And banking, you start to see this peer-to-peer lending, moving that direction, but still only lending. So what are there more services you could do? And so I think fintech is something that is prime for disruption in this sense.
I just think, anytime you look around and you notice a resource where there's like duplication and multiple people are buying it, like toothbrushes, for example. Does everyone really need their own toothbrush? I don't know.
I have Airbnb for toothbrushes. I'm an investor.
I'm not sharing my toothbrush. I'm going to go on the record. You can tweet that out. It's a big revelation. I think we spend a lot of our time on this exact topic, which is what are some of these undisrupted markets? What are the places where we can go and play? At Foundation Capital, we're miles deep in fintech. We have 7 or 8 significant companies there, and we actually totally buy your thesis, but we bought that thesis 5 years ago, and that's why we're so deep on all the peer-to-peer marketplaces. Not just around lending. There's a whole bunch of other really cool stuff that's happening in that arena. But if I look at 2 of the recent companies that we've gotten involved in, one is called HomeSuite. And what they're doing is, and I'm sure many of the people, if I asked this question, would raise their hand. It was true of me. Back when I was kind of doing construction and I worked on a fishing boat and I did all this other stuff, I had 27 jobs before my 23rd birthday, so I did a lot of things. I had the need for kind of interim housing, and HomeSuite is figuring out essentially an exchange for interim housing around the world. So if you need to stay more than a few days but less than a year, so that's a real marketplace. And another one that is lighting up kind of dark spaces is called Pier Space, and they're finding like really cool venues for meetings, offsites, things like that currently aren't on the marketplace, and they're drawing them on the marketplace with their platform. So we're always looking for new things like that run by exciting entrepreneurs, and we think they'll, in their own way, they'll change the world.
All right, well, thanks so much to our panelists. You heard it here first. Invest in fintech, home exchanges, and, of course, shared toothbrushes. Thanks very much.
Thank you.